So it's my honor to introduce our first speaker this morning, Professor Dan Reed from the University of Utah. So Dan Reed is the Presidential Professor in Computational Science at the University of Utah, where he previously served as Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs. He served in a variety of senior academic and industry roles, including as Vice President for Research at the University of Iowa, and as Microsoft's Corporate Vice President for Technology Policy and Extreme Computing. Before joining Microsoft, he was the founding director of the Renaissance Computing Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and director of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois. Dan is the past chair of the U.S. National Science Board, which provides oversight for the U.S. National Science Foundation, and he's a member of the Internet 2 Board of Trustees. He just completed multiple years of service as the chair of the Department of Energy's Advanced Science Computing Advisory Committee, or ASCAC, as many of us know it. Dan has also served as the member of the U.S. President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology and the U.S. President's Information Technology Advisory Committee. He's the past chair of the board of directors of the Computing Research Association, which represents PhD granting computer science departments in North America. As chair of CRA, he was one of the co-founders of the Computing Community Consortium, responsible for envisioning new ideas on computing research. Dr. Reed's a fellow of the ACM, the IEEE, and the AAAS. He received his BS from Missouri University of Science and Technology and his MS and PhD from Purdue University, all in computer science. So on a personal note, I've been fortunate to get to know Dan a little bit over the years through some of our joint committee work and workshops. Dan is one of the few people in computational science I've heard offer insights or nuggets of wisdom that have really made me stop and think, and which I found myself relaying to many of my colleagues. He's easy to find online and maintains a blog at hbcdan.org. I think you can also find him at Twitter or X at hbcdan. If you go to his blog, you'll find his comments on testimony that he delivered this past May before the Research and Technology Subcommittee of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. There's also a link to the video of the hearing in which Dan advocated quite strongly for a 21st century version of the National Defense and Education Act to address STEM education quality and inequities and rekindle the passion for discovery among both our students and our citizens. In summary, I can think of very few people who possess Dan's understanding of just how far computational science has come, but crucially what's needed for the United States to continue to lead from the front. Our community has seen a lot of change over just the past decade alone, and we are at something of an inflection point right now, where the road ahead is equal parts exciting and murky. We're very fortunate to have Dan with us here this morning, and I know many of us are eagerly looking forward to hearing his vision of the way forward. So Dan, now that I've sufficiently lowered expectations, I'd like to invite you up front. Please join me in welcoming.
All right, I'm going to wander around some here. I'm told I have to stay in this black square here, so I'm not sure what happens if I wander outside of it. But as John said, I want to talk to you a little bit about the past and the future and the fact that we are at a huge inflection point in computing writ large. And you, really, as the next generation of researchers, are going to help chart what that future is. You know, and there's an old saw that says, new ideas take hold because old scientists die. And there's some truth in that. And so new blood brings new ideas. And so I'm going to challenge you some to think a little bit about that. So here's what I want you to think about in a nutshell. So if you fall asleep after this slide, you've got the gist of it. As John said, computing is an incredibly rapid transition. You know, the hype around AI is, well, out of control. Clouds, we're facing challenges in silicon. We're looking at multi-module chiplets, and I'll say some more about that. Energy is a killer issue in computing at multiple scales. And economic issues and models are pretty profound as well. It is leading to some major societal and technical changes because of that. Massive data is changing the way we think about science. You know, it used to be that historically you did experiments because data was rare, expensive, and hard to get. And if I had a unique scientific instrument, I had advantage over you because I could ask and answer questions you might imagine, but you had no chance of actually pursuing. The broad access and democratization of access to data by virtue of survey instruments and other large scale has changed that sociology to a point where now advantage accrues to the person who can ask better questions. And that's a huge social upset. So that's one thing. But the other is, as we have sort of become accustomed to the free lunch of faster and faster computers for the same price, it's over, folks. You want bigger machines, faster machines, you're going to have to spend more money. And there's a practical limit to what society is willing to spend. There is no scenario in which I can imagine any government saying, I will spend $1 trillion on a research computer. No government. So there are practical issues there that get into sociology and government policy as well. As I said, transistors are actually getting more expensive. They're getting smaller still. And I'll talk some more about that in a moment, but they're getting more expensive. The cheapest point per 100 million for transistors was at 28 nanometer feature sizes. And we're now struggling to get down to 2. So Dennard scaling ended. I'll say some more about that. So here's the punchline. The locus of technology innovation and money have for sure shifted. They've shifted away from the traditional computing vendors to the AI and hyperscalers. And in some ways, it has shifted away from government and academia to industry. Because industry has no qualms about spending $10 billion a quarter on new infrastructure. Right? So the money is real. That's why the talk says follow the culture, the money, the technology. It's also a big global national security issue as computing has become central to the future of global competitiveness and also to national security. So I want you as scholars to realize that to be successful, you need to think at 3 time scales. And the easiest one, and the one that most people start with, is the first one, which is it's incremental improvements on current technologies. If I were to be crass, I would put it this way. If I can read someone's CV, the odds are high I can predict some variant of what the next papers they're going to write. That's the bread and butter of science, but it's the incremental stuff. If you're a young scholar and you're an academic, you can get tenure doing that. You won't be a superstar doing that, but you'll get tenure doing that. The next step up is strategic. Can you see the broad shifts in the field and be one of the leaders in driving them forward, and sometimes articulating what some of those are? That means, can you see the insights and potentials? Very few people manage to do the last one. And it is actually the most important one and the hardest, which is, can you see disruptive change coming and get ahead of the curve? Now, if you're too far ahead of the curve, you will be a prophet speaking in the wilderness because people won't understand what you're trying to say until it becomes obvious, and then they will forget you have said it. But understanding those disruptive changes is really, really important. And we're in the midst of one of those big changes right now. So if you think about the history of high-performance computing, yeah, that's me when I had hair, and just as an existence proof. At the time, at the time I started in high-performance computing, vector supercomputers were the coin of the realm. Everybody who was in the business had a Krell. And I'm proud to say I, like a few people in this room, am old enough to actually have known Seymour Krell personally. But about that time in grad school, I had this crazy idea that you could build supercomputers out of a whole bunch of microprocessors. Now, mind you, this is before the PC even appeared. And so this was not looked on as a highly probable outcome, but I had faith, and time proved that. We went from Krells to shared memory multiprocessors through MPPs. Eventually we got to what's still a version of the truth, Linux clusters. Somewhere around 2000, Rick Stevens from Argonne and I were having this crazy conversation about the PlayStation 2. And we noted that the emotion engine in the PlayStation 2 It was price performance wise, it blew out of the water anything that you could buy for computing, right? And that sort of was, I can't claim all the credit for it, but I can claim a little credit for it. That was kind of the beginning of the trend of what became GPU accelerators. And of course, we've continued that with faster and larger accelerators, and now we're dealing with, the impact of clouds and AI. So here's one of those things to think about disruptions. This is an old quote from Seymour when he was arguing for a continuation of the old model. He said, if you were plowing a field, would you rather have 2 strong oxen or 1,024 chickens? Well, the chickens actually won, and we genetically engineered the heck out of them. They may not be able to fly, but they're really big. So evolution continues, and part of the trick is seeing when there are these disruptions. You don't want to be the last person to build a vacuum tube computer. You don't want to be the last person to build a discrete transistor computer. You don't want to be the last person to bet on a technology that's about to disappear. About the same time, in the early 80s, I used to go around and give a talk with the working title of Chainsaws, Beavers, or Termites? Which direction shall we go? And the answer is mostly a combination of beavers and termites. That's what won, right? And so this went by the wayside. The other thing to think about is we have, in the past, there was a lot of diversity, which is really the point of the previous slide. We're in a technical monoculture right now. If you look at the top 500 machines, and first of all, I should be very clear, that's a non-representative benchmark. It's kind of like, how fast does your car go on a closed track in a straight line with a carefully prepared road and a tailwind behind you, and downhill to boot, right? It's not what your car actually does in practice. But basically, everything that's on the list almost is some sort of x86-based accelerator. All of those companies, they died. In fact, there's another old joke in high-performance computing. How do you make a small fortune in HPC? You start with a large fortune, you ship 2 generations of product, and you'll have a small fortune. Because it's not a way to make money, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So here's what I'm really trying to say. There's punctuated equilibria that take place in our ecosystem. There's a time when vector machines dominated. Then we were building these bespoke CMOS systems. They were custom machines built out of bit slice processors mostly, and some high-performance microprocessors. And then the Wintel ecosystem just steamrolled everything else, right? The economics dominated everything else, and that's what led to what was called the attack of the killer micros, which pretty much wiped out everything else in the HPC ecosystem. So the point really, as you think about the future, is when change comes, you adapt or you die. And most of the time, people die because they're unwilling to adapt rapidly enough. Nimbleness is the thing I want you to keep in mind. So you've probably seen a version of this slide before, and it's why we're out of the free lunch. Barb, Helen, and I were just talking about the fact that Bob Denard passed away a couple months ago. Denard scaling basically said that when you shrink transistors, not only do they get smaller, but they get faster and they get cheaper too. That went away. Moore's law, the fact that de facto performance would double roughly 18 to 24 months, that ain't true anymore either. Think about buying personal computers. It used to be that you would replace your PC, whether it was a laptop or desktop, every 2 or 3 years. Now there's not much reason to do that because the new one's not much better. You run it mostly till it wears out and you need to replace it. And that's because you're not getting anything better for the money, really. So what this chart really says is that most of the trends that we rode from the commodity ecosystem in terms of transistor scaling, faster processors, more dense memories, they're still going on, but we've run into some real roadblocks. See, here's the other thing to think about transistor shrinking. No exponential is forever, except in the math textbooks. So as transistors get smaller and smaller and smaller, and when I got in the business, they were about 3 to 5 microns. We're down in the 5 nanometer scale now. You can't go to 0, folks. That's no atoms. And as you get down to the 2 nanometer and below, you're talking about this many kind of atoms. And basic quantum effects really become important. So there is a limit at the bottom. I mean, we're pretty close to 2 nanometers now. People are talking about A7 and A2, and that's transistors that are 7 or 2 angstroms. So there's hope. But here's the thing to remember. We'll run out of money before we run out of physics. Let me say that again. We will run out of money before we run out of physics. Because the only thing that keeps driving this shrinkage is economic advantage. People can make money by shrinking transistors. When they can no longer make money shrinking transistors, or not enough money, it'll stop. And it has nothing to do with what's technically possible. It's entirely about what's economically possible. And so that's why part of the talk is follow the money as well. So, we've gone from 2D transistors to FinFETs to planar to FinFETs to gate-all-around. Transistor design itself, the geometry is getting more complex, and that's affecting yields, and I'll come back to that in a minute later. If you think about the top 500, this is a chart from John Shelf at LBL, and it sort of looks at the average performance improvement per decade for the sum of the machines on the top 500 list. Right? And you can see where Dennard scaling ended. Multicore kicked in about 2008. Moore's law started to slow down. And if you look over the last 5 years, basically we have not seen much performance improvement. It is increasing, but it's going to zero. And part of that is that you can't get more performance for the same price anymore. At least not much more. You have to put more coins in the machine. And there's a political limit on how many coins we can afford to put in the machine. So we could build machines faster, but we can't afford to do it in the academic and government sectors, at least under current policies. Now here's the other thing to think about change. You flew here on an airplane that's no faster than the ones your parents and your grandparents flew on. We can build faster airplanes. The economics just don't work. The Concorde, the supersonic transport, died because the economics didn't work. It's not that we can't build supersonic transports. We know how. Technology is fully mature. But the economics don't work for a consumer-based market. But if you think about what's happened in airplanes, the locus of innovation just shifted, right? We have carbon composites. We have fly-by-wire. They're much safer. Load management, yeah, that's the reason why there's someone packed next to you, has changed the economics. All of those things were innovations that were driven in part by technology, but the planes don't fly any faster. And again, it's not lack of technological understanding, it's lack of economic viability. So we're in a business that, unlike basic science, is in part affected by the economics of the commercial sector. And I want to keep coming back to that because it's really important. The other thing that we sort of relied on for certainly since the last 30 years has been weak scaling, right? So you got a distributed memory machine with lots of local memories. The machine gets bigger, there are more nodes. What do? Well, you do weak scaling. You shrink the spatial dimensions, and you scale up the problem. And for a long time that was great because we needed more spatial resolution than we were able to get on machines in the past. But there is a gotcha here, which is that, depending on the problem domain and the way you structure it and the solution method you use, weak scaling can drive the number of steps to an exorbitant level for convergence. And so there are limits on that. That's not a brick wall, but it is an impediment to our future scaling as well. And then here's one other thing I would encourage you to think about, which is the software development model that we use at HPC. It's robust, it's mature, it's reliable, but almost nobody else in the world uses it. Right, so MPI together with a lot of the x86 and Linux software we use, nobody else uses it. If you look at what the private sector is doing in clouds, or you look at what most commercial development is doing, There is some overlap, but there's a lot disjoint. And one year I gave a talk at the supercomputing conference, and I said, a statistically significant fraction of the people on the planet who know Fortran are within the sound of my voice. It is true. So I'm not saying we should abandon what we're doing, but there's a lot to be learned from the commercial sector because there's billions of dollars being poured into developing that ecosystem. So, and there is starting to be some convergence around high NHI. But I'll just remind you of this comment from Gordon Moore, right? You know, the more of Moore's law, that exponentials can't continue forever. At some point, something happens. And so we're at one of those inflection points now. So here's the follow the money part. If you think about how you make money selling anything, you either sell a lot of it at a fairly low margin, or you sell a small number, there's that black line, a small number of them at a really high margin. Now, if God help you and you're in a market where you can sell a lot of them at a high margin, man, you're going to be rich. But most people, most companies don't live in that space. So you either sell a lot of them at low margin, think hand soap, or you sell a small number of them at large margin, think Rolls Royces. And reality is usually somewhere in the middle. So if you think about HPC, most of the money in HPC is in mid-range HPC. That's the commercial, vibrant, technical sector of computing. What we do in academic and government mostly lives over on the left side of that curve. And so one of the struggles that we are having in HPC is when we go to buy a new machine and we have a few $100 million every few years, our influence on that ecosystem is waning. And I'll show you why with the next slide. But the goal of any business is to make money. And as John mentioned, I was a VP at Microsoft for a while, and I was trying to help the company through multi-core and the birth of cloud computing. And obviously, I'd been in HPC, and we were in the technical computing space too. And I went to Steve Ballmer, who was then CEO, and I said, Steve, I have an idea. I think we could make several $100 million a year. And he listened to my idea and he said, I'm not interested. And I'm like, I was kind of deflated, but I'm at least a persistent guy. And I said, why, Steve? Do you not believe me? Is it not credible in my argument? He said, no, I completely believe you. And I absolutely believe if we did that, we could make a few $100 million a year. But we're not doing it. I'm like, why? It's like, it's not worth the opportunity cost. We can make more money with the same amount of money doing something else. And that's part of the business ethos that's important to understand, is the opportunity cost and the time value of money and the ROI. It does actually matter. So here's one way to think about how the world has changed. And I've given several versions of this slide over the years. So the stuff on the left is what you would think of as a traditional computer or network company. So there's IBM, there's Intel, there's AMD, there's Samsung, right? Lenovo, HPE, there are a bunch of networking companies like Arista, Broadcom, and so on, Qualcomm. There's the three Chinese web companies, the so-called BAT companies, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. There are the hyperscalers over there, and there's NVIDIA. The market capitalization of either NVIDIA or any one of those bars, green bars, exceeds the sum of the market capitalizations of the traditional computer companies. Put another way, most of those companies could go buy one of those companies with cash on hand. Let me say that again. Most of those companies with cash on hand could go buy the computer vendors. They'd be stupid to do so. It'd be a horrible use of money. But it speaks to the power dynamic that has shifted, because money talks. And so if you're a Google or an Amazon or a Microsoft or a Meta, and you go to a chip vendor and you say, this is what I want, that's what they're going to do. Because that handful of companies is roughly half of the total market for those companies. It's the equivalent of Walmart and Procter & Gamble, right? If you're Procter & Gamble and you're selling shampoo to Walmart, Walmart has a lot to say with what you charge for it because they're a big chunk of your market. That's what's changed in the last few years. When I was at Microsoft, the market cap of Microsoft and Intel was roughly the same. This is the shift that's driving technical change. It's the money, and the money in particular is around web services and AI. Now, that's not bad. There's an opportunity there, and that's what I want us to think about. But it does mean that who we talk to, in part, has to change. Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room for a second, AI. Right? I mean, it's really no miracle. It's a combination of 50 years of research innovation. And we've been involved in academia and the national labs and all of those things, right? Supercomputers, PC clusters, accelerated PC clusters, that's the technology that's driving the AI revolution. Public clouds grew out of work on grids, right? A lot of our numerical work drove algorithms advances. And so we can justifiably take credit indirectly for a lot of contributions to this. But here's kind of what's going on, right? So part of what generated all the hype around AI was, for a long time, my AI friends said, you know, it's really annoying because everything we figure out how to do, people declare it an algorithm. The only stuff that's AI is stuff we don't know how to do yet. And as soon as we figure out how to do stuff, it's not AI anymore, it's an algorithm. And a lot of where people struggled were trying to apply algorithms to things like feature recognition, face recognition, handwriting recognition. Deep neural nets blew all of that out of the water, and the fact that those systems are now actually better than humans on pretty much all of those tasks. And that's a big change, right? And we're all, as consumers, taking advantage of this. But the truth is, deep learning, you know, with artificial neural nets, it's as simple as this. You take pretty much all of the digital human knowledge base, you run it through a big GPU cluster with some low precision linear algebra and some stochastic gradient descent, so some quasi-approximate nonlinear optimization of a potentially non-convex space, and it looks like magic. Another way to say it is, if I show you examples of pretty much everything humans have ever done, you can probably predict what they'll do next. That's all that's going on, right? But the low precision part is really important because we in HPC tend to believe that Velvel Khan went to the mountain and God gave him 64-bit IEEE floating point. It didn't exactly work that way. It was a great idea, it still is, but it's not the only floating point format. There are lots of other floating point formats out there, and a lot of work has been done on those over the years. But the killer issue here is that if you want to do training and inference in AI, 8-bit floating point is plenty. In fact, in some cases, 4, maybe even 2-bit is enough. Think about what 2-bit floating point is. You get 1 bit for a mantissa, and you get 1 bit for an exponent, right? That's a pretty gross approximation. You don't need a lot of precision, but you need a lot of them. And we have built most of our algorithms on, you know, a long history of algorithm-based numerical stability with high precision floating point. Now, I will remind you that if you go back and read the original papers that Johnny von Neumann wrote that really were the blueprint for modern digital computing, he was pretty dubious of floating point. He actually said anybody who needs floating point doesn't actually understand the dynamic range of their problem. Now, most of us are not Johnny von Neumanns, right? I mean, he was a wonderkid and a genius of another level. But it is true, if you really understand the dynamic scaling of your problem across its phases, you can do all of this in fixed precision, right? You just have to do it algorithmically. So there are opportunities there in the algorithm space. Now, here, of course, is the killer issue as we think about AI moving into science and certainly into issues that are important to national security. Here's an XKCD cartoon, and one character says, so this is your machine learning system? Yep, you just pour the data into this big pile of linear algebra and you collect the answers on the other side. It's like, what if they're wrong? We just stir the pile some more until it starts to look right. So all deep learning is statistics, right? And there's a great line from the statistician George Box that it's important to remember. He said all models are wrong. They're all wrong because by definition a model is a simplified approximation. It can be sophisticated, but it's nevertheless a simplification of reality. But he also said all models are wrong. Some models are useful, right? And so when you build a model of any kind, it's important to understand its domain of applicability. And if you step outside that domain, it's on you because you're getting garbage out the other end. So, right, just, I think you all know this, but I'll just remind you, training is about providing a whole bunch of data and building a predictive model. Inference, then, is taking the trained model, giving examples, and getting answers. So, identifying pets as an example. And of course, the numerical version of that is, can I build a trained model of my computational model that's reduced, which is to say it's computationally efficient compared to the original one, and then use that to do broader parameter studies because we're generally limited by the computational cost of our models. It's hard to do an exhaustive or more directed parameter space exploration. When it works, it's like magic, right? But the trick is that domain of applicability. So if you look at what Google, for example, has done with GraphCast, they can do high resolution weather forecasts that beat anything the Europeans or the US can do. And they could generate forecasts of up to a week in 10 minutes on one GPU with a trained model. Now, they won't predict extraordinary weather that has no precedent in history. But they will predict the statistical variations given input conditions that we normally see, right? And so there are opportunities there, but you got to understand the applicability. Now, I have to remind us that all the hype around AI is around a small part of AI, right? It's around this generative AI piece and deep learning. There's a whole lot of other stuff in AI that's worthwhile and is still going on, but it's not getting much attention right now. But here's the thing I want you to think about. And there's a little bit of 1984-ish George Orwell. If you remember 1984, if you haven't read it, you should. I won't make a political comment, but you can imagine it. But, when the war switches sides, they edit history and they say, we've always been at war with, right? And so the nature of cultural revolutions is, nope, we'll never do that, bang. Oh, we've always done that. We've always done that, right? And so understanding that transition is important. Here's why this is interesting in the context of AI. Most of what we do in computational science is drawn from deductive reasoning. Here's a model, here's a physical process. We've built a mathematical model. In most of our cases, it's some version of time-variant PDEs. And we build a software and we solve those, right? There's a long history in mathematics of that, a great history. But it's deductive reasoning. AI is inductive reasoning. It says, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of data. Find me a pattern. And that's different than saying, I know the pattern, I'm going to write an algorithm to express it, right? It's a cultural collision. And so there's another book I would recommend, which is Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, because it talks about the fact that these phase transitions occur and the cultural disruptions that take place with them. See my previous comment about new ideas take hold because old scientists die. So where do we go? And I'm mindful of time, and I want to make sure John will give me the hook so we have time for questions. So if you look at Alice in Wonderland, Alice says, where should I go? The cat says, well, that kind of depends on where you want to go. And Alice says, I don't know. And the cat says, well, it doesn't make much difference which direction you go if you don't know where you want to go. We're kind of at that point right now. So if you look at what's happening in the private sector space, and I was involved in some of it in the early days at Microsoft, there were unicorns in the hardware AI startup space. Remember, a unicorn is one with a market cap of $1 billion. There are people betting seriously on AI hardware. If you look at the pace of change that's taking place with Google, they announced TPU 6. With AWS building their own custom processors, Azure is doing the same thing now. I tried to get that started and it couldn't quite sell it at the time in the company, but they finally bought into the idea. Here's the thing to realize. If you're one of these companies, AMD or Intel's profit is your overhead. You want to eliminate all overhead you can because you can maximize profit. One way to do that is to take that stuff in-house, design your own chips, and design them customized for the workloads you want to run. Here may be the most important thing I want to say to you. I think going forward in HPC, we're going to have to do more of that ourselves. We're going to have to take ownership. And the truth is, the rest of large-scale scientific instruments has always done that. You don't go out to Walmart and buy a $1 billion telescope. You can buy some parts, but you have to custom design the system, test it, scale it. We're probably going to have to go down more of that space as well. We're going to have to embrace some of the overhead and the cost of designing more of our own hardware. Now, that's not easy, and I'll talk some about that. But here's kind of why, as John said, it's murky. We're not the big dog in the world anymore in technical computing. And so some of the vendors are increasingly unwilling to take on the financial risks to build our systems because $500 million, when you're looking at multi-billion-dollar market, well, say it this way, $500 million over multiple years compared to multiple billion in a quarter in the private sector, yeah, they're going to follow the money. That's kind of the reality. As I said at the outset, there's a limit on how big government is willing to invest for basic research. I mentioned weak scaling issues. So here's what's uncertain. You know, our buy stuff from the commercial market, it's not the sole answer anymore. I'm not at all convinced quantum is the answer. I do think it will be a partial answer, but probably not a complete answer. At least in my judgment, quantum is not very good for things that are I/O intensive, right? Because you've got to cross that barrier. It's really great if you believe in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that you want to compute for 1,000 years and produce 42. It's great for that. PDEs are important, and they always will be, but they're not all the answer. And like I said, IEEE floating point, at least in the 64-bit format, is not the only true way. And as all the hype that's going on around AI with large language models, there is a pony in there, to use a Reaganism, but it ain't everything either. So here's another way to think about it. There is a hypothesis in linguistics called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And it says the language you speak shapes how you think. And any of you who are multilingual, and I know there are many of you in the room who are, you know that the structure, the way you express thoughts in different languages is different. Some of it is grammatical order, there are gender issues, there are all kinds of things. But it does have some effect. This is a controversial thing that belief in the hypothesis has waxed and waned over the years. But the notion that the way we think, you know, there is a pattern in there that's habitual, you can get locked into a worldview, is absolutely true. And so one of the things I think we have to do is step out of that, and as I said, think about how to build some systems. Oh, this is the, oops, let me go back. This is what I was telling you about transistor cost. You can see the minimum point, this is cost per 100 million transistors. The low point was at 28 nanometers. Yep, thanks. So, what do we need to do? So this is drawn from a National Academy study, and Donna Crawford here was part of that. You know, we need a beat 'em and join 'em strategy. We need to both think about the near term, how we leverage some custom chiplets to integrate on existing hardware. But fundamentally, I also think we've got to step back with a clean sheet of paper and ask ourselves some deep questions. And that's the exciting research opportunity and a chance for you to think about the future in different ways. But to be sure, this old Far Side cartoon is true. You got to make sure you're tall enough to attack the city if you're going to attack the problem. Now here's the killer issue about designing custom hardware. I'm old enough to remember when a whole bunch of people built custom HPC machines. None of them succeeded. They all got overrun by Moore's law, because every 18 months, the machine got twice as fast. And if it took you 5 years to design and build your machine, you had to anticipate multiple generations of doubling. That's a hard thing to do. In a post-Moore's law, performance doesn't increase that fast. There's some great work by Neil Thompson at MIT looking at, based on how fast performance changes, how many units do you need to build in order to make it economically viable to customize? There's opportunity in that space. Something else to think about. Analog computing mostly died in the 60s. But we know that the way these things work are not exactly like anything that we build right now. They're low power, they're asynchronous, and they're error-prone. So the way we're running large language models is not representative of what actually happens in real biology. Biological neural networks, they're not synchronous, they're not fully connected, they're not high energy, and they certainly don't have separated compute and storage. They look more like a leaky integrated and fire kind of models. So this is some great work done by the biologists. They captured the connectome of 0.2% of a mouse brain recently. And we have fully identified the connectome of the fruit fly. Here's a really interesting thing to think about. If you take that connectome and you build a computational model of it and you subject it to stimuli, it responds in the same way that a real fruit fly does. So what can we learn from biology? Well, first of all, if I could build something that had the capabilities of a fruit fly at that scale, that could fly, walk, avoid obstacles, vision, and it was powered by something that fit on the palm of my hand and used a few drops of sugar water, every 2- and 3-letter agency in the world would be lined up outside my door. There's a lot of headroom here, folks, in how we think about the future. So I'll leave you with these thoughts. Semiconductor constraints are going to drive us to some new approaches. We're going to have to embrace co-design. We're going to have to build some prototypes at scale. A prototype that can't fail has another name. It's called a product. Build prototypes, they're experiments. It's okay for some of them to fail. AI and cloud economics have changed the world. The space of HPC is broader than we normally think about, and you can't forget the societal issues. I'm going to leave you with this. There's a great book, it's old now, by the Nobel laureate Peter Medawar. It's called Advice to a Young Scientist. He has some advice that says if you're full of hubris, it's worthwhile to be slapped across the head with a wet fish. I'm not going to go any further down that path, but there's some great advice about how to think about science in it, and it pretty much applies to anyone. And one of them is, go embrace people unlike you. They'll challenge your belief system. They'll make you think in different ways. You'll learn from them, and they'll learn from you. Take some risks. It's okay to fail. Not in a stupid way, but in a reasonable way. Try some things, right? Figure out what you do really well. Go work with some other people who figured out what they do really well, because together you can do things none of you can do separately. And then, to the point about failing, make new and original mistakes. Life is short. Experience should not be your only teacher. But you can do a lot if you take some risks. All right, and then as Yoda said, do or do not. There's no try here. Last thing I'll say is we're in the business of doing what Steve Jobs said. He read this old Scientific American article about the motive efficiency of different organisms, things that fly, things that walk, things that swim. Nothing comes close to a human on a bicycle. And he said, I'm in the business of trying to build a bicycle for the mind. That's what we're all in the business of doing. So thanks.